Hey everyone, my name is Billy. Welcome to my channel, and today I'm going to be talking about my journey as a software engineer and specifically transitioning from an IC, an individual contributor, to more of an EM role, engineering manager. So first off, I'm going to go through kind of what each of those terms mean and my experience going through that transition and what that looked like. So if you're new to the world of software engineering, usually what happens is you graduate from school, presumably, or from like a boot camp, and join a company as an entry level engineer. And that always starts off as you kind of doing individual work and learning the ropes, picking up more and more of the context at the company, and eventually, over the course of like a couple of years, you will hopefully be taking on more and more projects, and ideally, you would be taking on more and more ownership over those projects, and eventually owning kind of like larger and larger pieces of those projects. So that's kind of where everyone starts off. So everyone pretty much just starts off as an IC, an individual contributor, and usually around kind of the 3 year or so mark is where if you've been doing well, you're getting promoted, you hit this kind of split in the road, and so you can either kind of go down this typical individual contributor path or go down an engineering manager path. But a lot of times, especially in startups, those lines are pretty blurry and there's not a lot of resources to kind of give you an idea of what each of those mean, where those paths might lead, and like tips to help you make that decision. So I'll be talking about that here. So I'll start off with the IC role. When you do hit around that like 3 year mark, let's say, that's kind of where you might take on the role of like a senior engineer at the company. This kind of leveling structure is defined at a lot of the companies that have been around for a while. So like Google and Facebook now have all kind of adopted this similar growth framework leveling structure type thing. And so you have people who go from like entry level, they'll level up to like a progressive level engineer within like a year or two. Then they'll level up to like a senior engineer within like a year or two from that. From there, you become like a staff engineer or a senior staff engineer, principal engineer. That's kind of what it looks like down the IC path. And so as an individual contributor to a company, how you kind of get promoted and take on more responsibility is more as an individual, as the name suggests. So now what that looks like generally is you as an individual are taking on more technical expertise, more context of what the team is working on, the technologies that they're working on, the minor details of how services within the team interact, things like that. You're also taking on more responsibility at the project level. So what this usually means is kind of taking on this more of a tech lead role on projects. So you would be kind of the leader of a larger and larger scope technical project. So going from building like a single component maybe to like a system to like a larger scale system, and being kind of responsible for that. Now, being an individual contributor doesn't mean that you are now suddenly building these giant systems all by yourself. That just isn't feasible given how these systems are built. The amount of code that is required to build these systems generally doesn't scale linearly, and so even if you as an individual are kind of getting better technically, there's kind of a limit to the amount of code you can write out. And so what this usually means is you as a high-level IC will be taking a point on a project and doing a lot of the designing now of the system, kind of breaking down that system into what the components might look like to build out, and kind of scoping those out, making those into smaller projects on their own, and then delegating that to other engineers on the team, like usually more junior engineers, to help you build those pieces to that system. And then you would also be responsible for the kind of connecting of those systems as well, which itself can be a pretty complicated problem depending on what you're working on. Another aspect of being an IC is the role of mentoring more junior engineers on the team as well. So similar to you having to spec out a large project into a bunch of smaller components that people can do, and you would delegate those to junior engineers, you also would be responsible for mentoring those same junior engineers as to helping them level up in their technical expertise, in their context that they have within the team, and things like that. Now, a lot of that probably makes sense and is, a pretty clear path of progression from, joining a company as a new grad engineer to, gaining more responsibility and leveling up on the IC path. Now, the engineering manager path is where things diverge from this straightforward path of growth as an individual contributor. And this is partly why I think the transition to manager is a difficult one for a lot of people, because it's essentially a lateral shift in what you're doing, and your responsibilities kind of change really greatly from when you were just an IC and kind of building out projects. Now, instead of leading projects like an IC would do, an engineering manager is now responsible for leading the team. And now the focus shifts from you as an individual's output to as a manager what your team's output is. You're responsible for setting goals for your team and making sure that your team is hitting them. You're responsible for kind of easing the interaction between your team and outside teams, whether it be other engineering teams, other product teams, things like that. You're responsible for now within your team how the team collaborates, how the team resolves internal issues, and you're also responsible for individuals' development. So this is the career development for the engineers within your team, either kind of becoming better ICs or they themselves becoming managers. And part of that is also kind of how your team is growing or how your team is kind of retaining people over time. Now, I think that in the process of transitioning from an IC to an engineering manager, there will be this little bit of an in-between period, which is one thing I went through, where it's being a tech lead manager. Now, the tech lead manager role is something that typically happens when you have less than 4 direct reports. And this is where you are managing the small team, but then also doing a lot of the implementation and technical speccing work as well for the team. This is generally fine in the short term, especially as you're trying to build out a team and hire people to fill in spots. But as a long-term strategy, I would say that this is maybe not the most efficient way to progress in your career, since it's kind of a halfway point between being an IC and being a full-fledged manager. This is because, as an IC, you'll want to be growing your technical ability and taking on more responsibility on projects, but you're kind of only spending part of your time doing that, where the other part is you're spending kind of managing people. And then compared to a manager, you're only managing kind of a small team of people, whereas as a manager, you want to kind of grow into managing teams of like 6 to 8 engineers, and then eventually kind of building toward managing managers and managing multiple teams. So yeah, this is usually a transition point, and it's something that can be solved over time as you grow as a manager in your skills, and as you hire more people to be on your team, and then that way you as a manager can take on more responsibility as well, and can work on more projects. And if you're interested in reading more about the specific details of what an engineer's responsibilities are as an IC or as an engineering manager over the course of one's career, you can take a look at the link in the description to what Square's leveling system looks like as of, I think, 2019. They have a blog post and then a Google Sheet listing out the responsibilities of ICs and EMs at different levels. Now, for me personally, like I said, I'm now an engineering manager at Wish, and my progression to this point has actually been pretty organic, which I'm thankful for. So what that looked like is I joined the company right after graduating from college, and started out as any normal junior engineer. I was given pretty well-defined tasks and small projects to work on, and did whatever work there was that needed to be done from my manager. Hopped around on a bunch of different areas of the product that we were working on, just because at the time that was the nature of the work, where we were a pretty small team. I think we had about like 8 to 10 people total on the team that I was on, and we were building out all these random features that we needed to have built out. Eventually, as the team grew and the company grew and we needed a little bit more structure and ownership, I started taking over on a specific part of the product we were working on, which was kind of anything related to orders that our sellers were seeing, since we worked on the seller side. And that was kind of where I started taking on larger scoped projects as well, taking on more ownership, dealing with more kind of ambiguous problems that were left to me to figure out and determine the solutions for. And kind of around the same time was when the company started developing a more robust kind of framework for engineers. Previously, there weren't any levels really defined at all for engineers. The organization was like very flat in terms of like no one had different titles. Like everyone was just a software engineer. And even like my manager was, even though he was managing the entire team, was, on paper just like a software engineer. And so it was just very timely for me where like as I was growing as an engineer and kind of, going from like a entry level to like a progressive to like a senior engineer, this was around the time where this like growth framework and leveling system was established within Wish. So this happened around the kind of 2.5 to 3 year mark is when kind of the leveling really started kicking in. And at that point, I had also kind of grown as an engineer as well. And so I think by my 3 year mark at the company, I was leveled at a senior engineer position. And so, like I was saying before, as a senior level kind of IC, you're expected to take on a lot of the problems that come up and kind of disambiguate them, figure out what solutions are needed for them, and also work on some more complex systems and having ownership over those systems. At that point, I was also actively mentoring interns for a while. So our company hires a lot of interns, and previously I started out just mentoring a single intern where I would kind of be responsible for giving them work to do, delegating some of my stuff to them, or figuring out different things that they could work on in addition to what I was working on. And that eventually kind of grew to having 2 interns for a while. So about 8 months to a year after I hit that senior engineer mark, my manager kind of asked me where I wanted to go from here. Did I want to continue on the IC track? Did I want to go down the managerial track? And at the time, I really didn't have any idea what a manager was supposed to do or like what they did on the day-to-day. I saw that my manager had a ton of meetings that she was dealing with. She wasn't coding. I would present, like technical documents to her and get her feedback and approval on things like that. But outside of that, I wasn't, too sure what the direct actions and effects a manager had on the team. So I kind of also at the time saw the need within the team and our org to kind of grow a little more horizontally and have more managers so that the org itself could grow. And I think some aspects I was aware about in managing did interest me. So I'm also interested in coaching in terms of professional coaching, but I saw a lot of parallels between that and some aspects of managing where you want to be teaching your reports and kind of coaching them to become more senior or potentially take on their own teams. That's kind of the mindset I went into managing with, where it seemed like it was something I wanted to explore. It was a need in the company, and there was an opportunity for me to do it. So I decided to go along that path. And so what ended up happening was I went from, in March, I had just 2 interns to by the end of July, I had 4 direct reports full time. So this was a pretty big shift in terms of my day-to-day responsibilities, kind of going from focusing on building projects and, solving problems directly to now having to manage a bunch more people than I had before, making sure that they had work to do, they were unblocked and could do whatever they needed to do. And so this is kind of where I took on a tech lead manager type role that I mentioned previously, where I was doing some form of managing and trying to figure things out and get a feel for managing a team, and also doing a lot of technical work myself of kind of like figuring out these problems, speccing things out for people to implement. Now, after a few months of doing this, I found that, I kind of was in the groove. So I was able to manage kind of the inflow of projects, okay, and, assign those things out. But besides kind of maintaining the flow, the input-output flow, I wasn't sure what I needed to be doing to kind of make things work in the long term. And I was getting to the point where doing this TLM role supported, these 3 to 4 engineers that I was working with. But if I were to get more engineers, that would just be kind of more work in this flow. And it didn't really scale for me at that point. And this is a common thing that happens, I think, when people hit about 3 to 4 direct reports, is that you just can't do like what you were doing potentially as a TLM before, and you need to kind of figure out how to manage more and more direct reports in a scalable way, since usually you'll want to be targeting kind of 6 to 8 engineers on a team. So recently I found some pretty good resources on how to grow a team and scale a team and scale an organization sustainably. But this video has kind of gotten to the 15-minute mark already. So what I'm going to do is just make a new video about that material specifically and kind of go into some detail there. So that's pretty much it for what my journey from being an IC to becoming an engineering manager has looked like. Please let me know in the comments if you have any resources that you really like for how you learn skills as a manager, both technical skills and the non-technical. Give this video a like if you like the content. That tells me and that tells YouTube that this is something that you're interested in. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, hit subscribe, because I'll definitely be making more tech-related and engineering-related content in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time.